A handwritten note I'd never seen before, tucked inside my husband's old coat pocket. I wasn't even looking for anything. I was sorting through the hall closet, pulling out winter things to donate when my fingers brushed against folded paper. Small, neat handwriting. A woman's handwriting. "Thank you for everything. I'll never forget what you did for us. M." My husband had been dead for 6 years. I stood there in my hallway for a long time, holding that note. Outside, the October leaves were coming down in slow spirals. Inside, something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the season. I told myself it was nothing. A colleague, a neighbor, someone he'd helped years ago and never mentioned. My husband was that kind of man, quiet about his kindnesses, generous in ways he never announced. I'd loved him for 41 years. I knew him. Except, apparently, there were things I didn't know. I set the note on the kitchen counter and went back to the closet, found 3 more boxes to donate, made myself a cup of tea, went to bed early, and lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a woman named M. That was a Tuesday. By Friday, I had convinced myself it was nothing. By the following Monday, I'd convinced myself it was something. The problem wasn't the note itself. The problem was that I kept thinking about the last 2 years of my husband's life. The phone calls he'd step outside to take, the weekend afternoons he'd said he was running errands, and come back empty-handed, the way he'd sometimes look at me across the dinner table with an expression I couldn't quite read. I'd chalked all of it up to the stress of his illness. He'd been sick, we'd both been scared. People behave strangely when they're frightened. But that note, "Thank you for everything. I'll never forget what you did for us." Us. There was someone else. I'm 63 years old. I have 2 grown children, 4 grandchildren, a vegetable garden I'm inordinately proud of, and until that Tuesday in October, I believed my marriage had been a good one. Not perfect, no marriage is, but solid, honest, built on 41 years of showing up for each other. I was not prepared to have that belief shaken by a dead man who couldn't explain himself. I did what any reasonable woman my age does when she's troubled. I called my daughter. She was sympathetic, practical, and quick to reassure me. "Mom, Dad knew a lot of people. It could be anyone. Don't spiral." She was right. I knew she was right. I spiraled anyway. I started going through things I hadn't touched since he passed. Not obsessively. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't ransacking the house. I was just paying closer attention, looking at the life we'd built together with fresh eyes and hating myself a little for doing it. Most of what I found was exactly what I expected. Old tax documents, birthday cards from the grandchildren, a shoebox full of photographs from our trip to Ireland in 2009, a letter he'd written me on our 30th anniversary that made me cry for 20 minutes. And then, at the back of his desk drawer, underneath a rubber-banded stack of old receipts, I found a phone. Not his regular phone. A second one, small old, the kind people used to buy prepaid at drugstores. The battery was dead. I held it in my hands for a full minute before I went and found a charger that fit. It powered on slowly. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. My tea went cold. There were text messages, not many, maybe 30, spread across 8 months. The contact was saved simply as M.I. read them all. And when I was finished, I sat very still for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called my son. My son, he's 56, steady, the kind of man who thinks before he speaks, listened without interrupting while I told him about the note, the phone, the messages. When I finished, there was a pause. "Mom," he said carefully, "what exactly did the messages say?" "That's the thing," I told him. "I need you to help me understand them." He drove over that evening. We sat at the kitchen table together, the little prepaid phone between us, and went through everything again. The messages were careful, cautious. They didn't say much directly. There were references to meetings I hadn't known about, to money my husband had apparently given to someone, to a situation that was described only as the problem with the house. Im thanked him repeatedly, apologized for the burden, said she didn't know what they would have done without him. In one message she wrote, "She can never know. You understand that, right? It would destroy her." My son read that one twice. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he asked. "None," I said. That wasn't entirely true. I'd been turning over names since Monday. Women my husband had known. Women we'd both known. Old colleagues, distant relatives, neighbors from the house we'd lived in before we moved here. One name kept surfacing, and I kept pushing it back down because I didn't want it to be true. My husband's sister had a daughter, a niece of his we'd been close to when she was young, and then, gradually, less close to as she'd grown up and moved away and built a complicated life we'd only ever seen the edges of. Her name was Margot. She went by M&M. I hadn't spoken to Margot in almost 4 years. We'd exchanged Christmas cards. That was all. I asked my son if he remembered the last time he'd seen her. He thought about it. "Dad's funeral," he said. "She came to the funeral." She had. I remembered now. She'd sat in the back and left quickly before the reception. I'd thought she was just being respectful, giving the immediate family space. "I think I need to talk to her," I said. My son looked at me with the particular expression my children wear when they're worried about me, but trying not to show it. "Mom, are you sure you want to do this?" "No," I told him honestly. "But I don't think I have a choice." Margot was not easy to find. She'd moved at least twice since we'd last had a current to dress for her. My son did some looking and found that she was living in a small town in western Pennsylvania, about 4 hours from me. She had a Facebook page she rarely updated. The last post was a photograph of a front porch with a new coat of paint captioned, "Finally." I stared at that photo for a long time. I thought about calling. I thought about writing a letter. I thought about sending a message through Facebook and then deleted the draft 3 times. In the end, I drove. I know how that sounds. A 63-year-old woman driving 4 hours alone to knock on the door of a relative she hadn't spoken to in years, based on a dead man's old text messages. I know it sounds impulsive, possibly unhinged. My daughter, when I told her afterward, used the word reckless more than once. But I'd spent 2 weeks lying awake at 3 in the morning with a question I couldn't answer, and I had decided that I needed to look Margot in the face when she answered it. I left on a Thursday morning. The drive took me through country I'd forgotten was beautiful. Small towns, old farms, hills going gold and orange in the late October light. I stopped for coffee twice. I listened to the radio and tried not to rehearse what I was going to say, because every version I rehearsed sounded wrong. I found the house just after noon. It was a small colonial on a quiet street, the porch freshly painted white. There was a child's bicycle leaning against the railing, flower pots with the last of the season's mums. I sat in my car for 10 minutes. Then I got out and knocked on the door. Margot answered it herself. She was 42 now, and she looked tired in the way that some people do when they've been tired for a long time and have started to wear it as something permanent. She looked at me and something moved across her face, surprise, and then something I couldn't quite name. "Aunt Ruth," she said. That was what she'd always called me. Aunt Ruth. Even though I was technically only her aunt by marriage, which made me no blood relation at all. "Hello, Margot," I said. She looked at me for another moment. Then she opened the door wider and stepped back. "Come in," she said. "I'll put on coffee." The inside of the house was modest and clean, with the slightly overwhelmed look of a home being held together on a tight budget. Children's drawings on the refrigerator. Library books on the coffee table. A basket of unfolded laundry on the couch that she moved without comment so I could sit down. She had 2 kids, I learned. A boy of 10 and a girl of 7. They were at school. She worked part-time at a medical billing office and was finishing an online degree in accounting. She told me all of this in a careful, measured voice while the coffee brewed. I noticed she didn't ask why I was there. "The children's father?" I asked. "Out of the picture," she said. "Has been for 5 years." I wrapped my hands around the coffee mug she handed me. It was warm, and the kitchen smelled like cinnamon. Outside the window, a squirrel was working furiously at something in the backyard. "Margot," I said, "I found a note." She went very still. "And a phone," I said. She set her own mug down on the table. Her hands, I noticed, were steady. She'd been waiting for this, I realized. Maybe not for me specifically, maybe not on this particular Thursday, but she'd been waiting for something like this for a long time. "He made me promise," she said quietly. "He said you couldn't know. He said it would hurt you." "He was protecting me," I said. It wasn't a question. "He was protecting you," she agreed. That was just who he was. And then she told me, 5 years before he died, when Margot was in the worst of it, newly single, 2 small children, a house she couldn't afford, a job she'd just lost, she had called my husband in desperation. Not me. Him. She'd always been closer to him since childhood. He was the one in the family who didn't make her feel judged. He had listened to everything, and then, without telling me, he had helped. Not a little help, real help. He'd paid 2 months of her mortgage when she was about to lose the house. He'd helped her find a lawyer when her ex fought her on custody. He'd driven 4 hours, the same 4 hours I'd just driven, on 3 separate occasions to sit with her and help her figure out what came next. He'd set up a small savings account for her children that I was apparently named as backup trustee on, which I'd never known because the paperwork had gone to a P.O. box and I'd never thought to look. He'd done all of it quietly, carefully, without ever asking for credit. And he'd asked Margot not to tell me because, and here she faltered a little, her voice going soft, because he knew I'd been struggling too that year. My mother had been sick. I'd been stretched thin and frightened, and he hadn't wanted to add to my worry. He'd thought if he could just quietly handle this one thing, he could protect us both. He called it running interference, Margot said, and smiled a little despite herself. He said that's what dads do. I had to put my mug down. My hands weren't as steady as hers. He wasn't her father, I said. No, she agreed, but he was the closest thing to one she had after hers passed. I'd forgotten that. Margot's father, my husband's brother, had died when Margot was 11. My husband had stepped in quietly then, too, in the way he did. Showing up. Staying. We sat together in her small kitchen for another hour after that. She showed me photographs I'd never seen, my husband sitting at her kitchen table with her children when they were small, reading to them from a picture book, looking entirely at home. Her son had apparently called him Grandpa, which my husband had never mentioned to me once. I cried. She cried. We went through half a box of tissues and then, at some point, started laughing a little, because the whole thing was so entirely, painfully like him. This man who had spent 41 years taking care of the people around him so gently that half the time they didn't even realize it was happening. Before I left, Margot held my hands for a moment at the door. "I'm sorry you found out this way," she said. I always hoped he'd tell you eventually. Find the right moment." "He ran out of time," I said. "He ran out of time," I said. "He ran out of time," she agreed. I drove home the long way, through the hills in the dark. I stopped at a diner outside of Harrisburg and ate a piece of pie I didn't need, and stared out the window at the parking lot and thought about 41 years. I thought about all the small moments I'd never paid enough attention to. The evenings he'd seemed distracted, the weekends he'd been quieter than usual, the times I'd sensed something unspoken between us and told myself it was just the ordinary mystery of another person. the parts of a spouse you never fully see. I'd been right about that, it turned out. Just not in the way I'd feared. I thought about the letter he'd written me on our 30th anniversary, which I'd cried over 3 weeks ago, and which was now sitting on the nightstand next to my bed. In it, he'd written that the thing he was proudest of in his life was not anything he'd built or earned or accomplished, but the people he'd been allowed to love. He'd said that loving people well was the only work that mattered, and that I had taught him most of what he knew about how to do it. I'd thought, when I read it, that it was a beautiful thing to say. I understood now that he'd meant it as a literal truth. There are things you don't know about the people closest to you. I used to think that was a sad fact, a limitation, a sign of the distance that exists between even the most devoted people. Sitting in that diner, eating pie in the dark, I started to think about it differently. Some of the things you don't know are the places where another person was quietly doing what needed to be done, without asking you to hold the weight of it. Some of the things you don't know are the kindnesses that happened in the spaces you didn't see, the generosities that were given freely because that's who they were, not because they needed you to witness it. My husband did not have a secret he was ashamed of. My husband had a secret he was proud of, that he'd kept not to deceive me, but to spare me, in a year when I was already carrying too much. He had looked at the situation and done what he always did. He figured out what needed to happen, and he made it happen, and he didn't make a production out of it. That was who he was. That was who I'd married. I got home close to midnight. The house was dark and quiet, the way it always is now, the way I've slowly gotten used to without ever quite getting used to it. I went straight to the nightstand and picked up the anniversary letter and read it again, standing there in my coat. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there for a while. I thought about calling my son, but it was late. I thought about calling Margot, but we'd already said what needed to be said. I sat in the quiet and let the whole day settle over me. In the morning, I called my daughter and told her everything. She cried before I did. She said, "That is the most dad thing I have ever heard in my entire life." And then we both laughed, and then we both cried, and then she made me promise to take a rest day before I did anything else. I took the rest day. I worked in my garden, even though most things were finished for the season. I pulled up the last of the tomato cages and turned over a bed and thought about what I'd plant in the spring. Margot and I talk regularly now. I've been to see her twice more since that October Thursday. Her children call me Aunt Ruth, which is apparently what she called me when she talked about me to them all those years when we were out of touch. I'm helping her with the accounting degree, not with money, just with reading the material over video calls on Sunday evenings, talking through the things that don't make sense. It turns out she's very good at it. She has her grandfather's head for numbers, she told me once, and I said that made sense, since her uncle had that same quality, and we sat with that for a moment. How much of him is still walking around in people, in the small ways they carry what he gave them? The savings account he'd set up for her children is still there. I transferred the trustee paperwork into my name properly with a lawyer, and told her it was for the kids' college if they wanted it, no conditions. She tried to tell me it was too much. I told her it was what their grandfather would have wanted, and that settled it. I kept the note. It's in the box with the anniversary letter now, and the photos from Ireland, and the birthday cards from the grandchildren, and all the other pieces of a life that keep meaning something long after the person who made them is gone. I take it out sometimes and read it. Thank you for everything. I'll never forget what you did for us. I don't know if you can be jealous of someone who is no longer alive to misunderstand. I don't think what I feel qualifies as jealousy anymore. It's something else, a tenderness maybe, or a particular kind of awe. The awe you feel when you realize you shared your life with someone who was even more themselves than you'd known, who had depths that went further than you'd seen, even after 41 years. I am 63 years old. I live alone now, in a house full of evidence of a good marriage. I have a garden that does better each year, children who call regularly, grandchildren who make me feel like the world is in better hands than the news would suggest. And I have a small painted porch 4 hours away, with a bicycle leaning against the railing and 2 children who call me Aunt Ruth, and Sunday evenings on video call, talking through accounting problems with a woman who loved my husband quietly for 20 years and is now, slowly, letting me know her properly. I thought I was looking for a secret. What I found was more of him. And after all the cold nights and the worried mornings and the hours spent turning over questions I didn't know how to ask, that turned out to be exactly enough.